So I would argue there's basically two trends that we can see these days. One is in Asia, or it's a global trend as well. As we see that China is maturing, wages have started to rise there, you will see that increasingly labor-intensive industries start to move out of China. And of course, everybody's excited to gobble up as many of those jobs that are now coming, especially here in Southeast Asia, the countries that have recently joined the TPP, but of course also Thailand. And I know from my Indian friends and Bangladeshi friends that everybody is waiting for these jobs. But there is another trend which is slightly more worrying, and that is that we see on the global level the trend and the direction of capital flows have been reversing, showing a tendency to move from south to north. Of course, that's not new. We've seen that many times before in the last 2 decades. And of course, a lot of that has to do with worried investors trying to save their assets and bring them into safe havens in the north. However, I believe that there is an underlying trend which is slightly more worrying, and that has to do with the reshoring of manufacturing into the old industrial powers to come closer to their customers. So why is that? What is happening here? That has a lot to do with the automation, digital automation. We're talking about robots now, not about social media and stuff like that. We're talking about factories with robots. This digital automation basically has 2 major outcomes. Number one, and that is particularly worrying for a country like India, which needs, in order to absorb, the exploding population and the migration from the rural into the urban centers, to create 1.2 million jobs per month for the next 4 years, which is an incredibly tall order. And of course, one of the hopes out there is that the big job machine, like what we've seen so successfully in East Asia, is going to be manufacturing. The problem is now the factories that are coming and the FDI that is coming into the country, these are robots with a few people around. So where in the past we saw tens of thousands of workers toiling in a factory, now there's a few hundred and a couple of robots. So the job machine effect is actually not there anymore. And second, when we see that digital automation replaces labor with capital, which makes labor a lesser factor in manufacturing. And that means it undercuts the very competitive advantage that put the emerging economies on the map in the first place. What you're seeing is that with labor becoming a lesser factor, the old industrial centers, the US, Europe, and Japan, become competitive again. So this is already visible in numbers. If you look at the manufacturing cost of major emerging economies, some of them are approaching or have already surpassed the manufacturing cost in the United States. So this is a trend that we are watching. And what is happening when that is happening, it means that when labor as a cost factor is relevant, other factors become more relevant. Of course, number one, the long distance of transport and the supply chains. It has to do with rule of law, corruption, the competency of local government. Of course, political stability is a huge factor. We talk about the skill set of the workforce. And last but not least, we talk about energy. So you look into the manufacturing cost in an economy like Germany, which happened to be the country where I'm from, you will see an interesting trend. You will see that labor no longer is the major cost factor in manufacturing. In fact, imported commodities is. We're talking about raw materials, obviously, but we're also talking to a large degree on energy. So this is why Western Europe in particular, but I would say the industrial countries as a whole, are pushing so hard for the energy transformation. Of course, partly that has to do with climate change. But I would argue that this argument of climate change has been around for 50 years and nothing much has happened. And suddenly we see all of this stuff accelerating at a very fast pace. So there's 2 other factors that are actually coming in and are actually changing the political equation of the energy transformation. Number one is geopolitics. Because we had a good look on the map and we saw where is all that dirty stuff coming from that we're digging out of the earth. which is coming from Russia, the Middle East, and North Africa, and these are countries which are considered a geopolitical headache. So getting independent from them, energy security is a huge factor which is actually driving the energy transformation. But of course, and that brings us back to the equation that we're having here today, becoming competitive in the global market, the reshoring factor is the other big driver of the energy transformation. Because if labor is no longer the biggest factor, and it will decreasingly be so if more robots enter the workforce, so to say, then energy becomes the key point to worry about. And if we look at the development of energy, we see that there have been a couple of breakthroughs in technology which are really changing the field. This year, 2015, is the first time in history that electricity from solar power is cheaper than from any other energy resource that we have in most countries of the world. And increasingly, we have grid parity of electricity in solar electricity in many countries around the world. Second, if you think about these storage facilities that have been developed by companies like Tesla, we see that the biggest headache of renewables, the intermittency, the wind is blowing, there's a lot of energy, wind is not blowing, there's no energy, that is actually being addressed quickly right now. So the reasons why not to do that are losing credibility. So while in the short run, next 5 to 10 years, the energy cost in the industrial cores will go up, in the long run, increasing efficiency, energy security, and of course the cost factor will make energy cheaper and more reliable in the old industrial centers. So in sum, this means that the technological and political shifts that are going on make it increasingly difficult to follow the export-driven, manufacturing-led catch-up industrialization model which was so successful over the last 30 years. And honestly, we haven't really developed another one yet, which is a headache. All this means, and this brings us to the title of this presentation, that for late industrializers, basically most of the countries assembled here around the table, the quest for development increasingly becomes a gigantic race against time. That is basically the economic lay of the land. So what needs to happen, obviously, is for emerging economies to move up the global skills and value chain as quickly as possible. Getting stuck in this global race may cause stagnation for a while and eventually decline. So graduating from one development stage to the next is no small task. And we all know it requires a multitude of economic and technical and governance reforms in all sectors of society. Transformation, however, does not occur in a vacuum, or laboratory for that matter, but it creates, of course, conflicts between winners and losers, between those who embrace change and those who fear it. And amidst this vertigo of change, and amidst this conflict, what would be necessary technically to graduate to the next development stage may not be possible to implement politically. And this is actually where we want to go with this conference here today. So in the race for development, societies face the risk of falling into a transformation trap. And this transformation trap can be defined as the inability to resolve the political, social, and economic challenges of transformation, triggering a situation where increasing conflict, a lack of innovation, and eroding legitimacy lead to stagnation and decline. So that's my definition of a development trap. So why is it so difficult to escape this development trap? What are these political and social challenges that all we have been mentioning this morning? Well, number one is one of the topics of this conference here today, which you may call the political economy of change. As I said, change produces winners and losers. And this means those who benefit from the status quo tend to resist change. And this is particularly true for the extractive political economies that we know. Extractive in the sense that the few extract resources from the many. So those few have little or no incentive to change. Political change then is the outcome of a struggle between those who benefit from the status quo and seek to uphold the old order, and those who seek change. Change, therefore, can only occur if a broad societal change coalition prevails in this transformation conflict. Hence, those who seek to build a democratic society have to create the political muscle to prevail in this struggle. So obviously these are elites that benefit from the socio-economic lay of the land. I think that's the most easy part to understand. But that's actually not how the transformation conflicts look like in most countries of the world. There is a lot of people whose socio-economic interest would actually point towards change. However, they resist change. And that is an interesting thing to look into. And the reason for that is that transformation conflicts are often framed in cultural terms. We're not talking about socioeconomic change. We're talking about race, gender, religion, ethnicity, and here in Thailand we're talking about morality. So these are cultural terms, and that has to do that what we are seeing, this transformation and that vertigo of change, as I call it, means that in these rapid times of change, a lot of people feel threatened in their identity because the world that they've been socialized into is rapidly disappearing. We're talking about the role of the father in the family, the role of the boss in the factory or in the civil service. We're talking about gender roles. All of these things are changing very quickly, and there is a lot of people who embrace that change, and there is some who are threatened by it. So by blaming scapegoats for the alleged moral decline of society, cultural flames help to enlist those who actually fear their identities despite their socioeconomic interests into the alliance of the status quo. So it's a trick, so to say. You frame it culturally and you get all of those who should be on the other side on your part of the ship. So playing the race, gender, religion, ethnicity card is the oldest trick in the book for rulers to fail to deliver on development promises, helping them to fend off resisting and challenging their rule. So if you think about, what is Putin doing in Russia? What is Erdogan doing in Turkey? What is Malaysia doing right now? Or what is Thailand doing right now? You see that as long as the economic engine is running nicely, well, all is good. Capital is happy, middle class happy, everybody's happy. But as soon as the engine starts to stutter, you will see race, gender, religion, and ethnicity come into the discourse, and that will change the equation. In many transformation conflicts, there is a particular puzzle, and that has to do with the middle class. You will see that the established middle class in the capitals plays a decisive role, which is a little bit like the swing vote, tipping the balance between those who seek to uphold the status quo and those who seek change. And this goes against our conventional wisdom because we believe the middle class is always a driver for good governance, accountability, transparency, democracy. But what we see is more often than not, the middle class actually sides with those who represent the status quo. So why is it the middle class, or to be more precise, the established middle classes in the capital who are revolting? And they are revolting. There is a lot of evidence that more than 20 cases of middle class revolts have happened around the world in the last 10 years. So there is basically a trap, which a sandwich situation that the middle class is fearing. As behind the modern facades, the patronage culture is still what is really informing the political culture in many societies. You will see that a ruler, in order to remain a ruler, is, from the perspective of the middle class, abusing power. Because if you want to be a patron, and you want to stay a patron for long, you have to reward your supporters you have to favor your own kin, you have to protect your clients, and you have to distribute the spoils. And in the process of doing that, you are violating the rule of law, you're trampling on political rights, and you're destroying institutions. That is a threat for the class that actually depends more than others on the rule of law and a merit-based social order. So the middle class feels threatened by these abusive elites. At the very same time, 20, 30 years of development are actually unleashing development in the peripheries, in the rural-urban periphery, so to say. A lot of, and that's one of the things that's fascinating to watch here in Thailand, the periphery is actually globalizing directly. You know, in the past you had to go through Bangkok. Now you see that the rice farmers are selling their stuff on the global market. The tourism industry is globalizing directly. FDI brings in manufacturing, which is globalizing directly. So that leads to an empowerment of the provinces and to the emergence of winners and emerging classes who just want the same thing as everybody else. Political rights, opportunities, life chances. And in order to get that, they want something from the state. And the state actually needs to provide that. So it's very interesting right now, because what we're seeing is that in order to win the race for development, well, you need to unlash innovation, because you cannot be stuck in a cheap labor paradigm for long. So that means the investment into the innovation, into the heads, is what becomes critical. You need a skilled workforce, and that costs a lot of money to invest in human capital. So who's going to foot the tax bill for that? We all know it's not going to be the rich. And for social reasons, it's also not possible that the poor pay for that. So it's the middle class who's going to foot the tax bill. And the middle class, as long as it's feeling abused and threatened, revolts. So that means the middle class is basically stopping the very mechanism that allows you to move up the global value chain and gets you in precisely that trap of decline and stagnation. So as long as the middle class feels threatened and abused, the very graduating to the next stage of development is not possible, and that is why it's important to watch them. Number 4, in a situation where many reforms are necessary, the very situation where a lot of reforms are necessary to graduate to the next level, the way the governance system works no longer. Because transformation not only modernizes the economy, but it changes the society. The economy and the society become more complex, more diverse, more pluralized. We have more conflicts between different lifestyles, identities, and interests, which is eroding the old vertical setup of a society and is creating, if you wish, a more horizontal society. So that's actually quite a practical problem, because in a horizontal, fragmented society, the top-down and exclusive way, the technocrat way of governance, no longer works. So what is needed is a more decentralized and participatory political order, where the governance system is able to satisfy the needs and demands of a complex economy and a pluralistic society. So we're seeing more resistance to top-down reforms. We see more escalating social conflict, and we see a stuttering economy. All of that is eroding the legitimacy of the system, and that makes it so difficult to implement the reforms at a time where a lot of reforms actually need to be implemented. That is a big headache in the transformation. Finally, if escaping the transformation trap means to break the resistance to political, social, and economic innovation, those who seek change need to create the political muscle to implement it. Only a broad societal coalition can actually field this political leverage. Broad societal coalitions, however, are very difficult to build. And this has to do with a lot of collective action problems, and I'm just going to point out one of them, which is that in the here and now, social groups tend to have not the same or diverging or even opposing interests, identities, and priorities. So if you wish to build a coalition, you will quickly find that you do not have a common platform. So what we are often trying to do in our society is to find the lowest common denominator and then say, let's do that stuff together. But that lowest common denominator is so small, is so narrow, that it's not a platform for a broad societal coalition to transform the system. In a country like Thailand, you could argue that the lowest common denominator is almost zero, and which is why the political process is paralyzed. So the consequence is that you cannot build a transformative alliance, and that means the status quo alliance prevails, undercutting innovation and putting you directly into the development trap. So what needs to be done to escape this transformation trap? This is something that we're going to talk about tomorrow. Today we would like to stick with the better analysis of the problem, but just to lay it out there, in order to win the race for development, economies obviously need to move up the global skills and value chain. This requires the implementation of a lot of reforms. Escaping the transformation trap then means to create the social peace and the political stability which is necessary as a precondition to implement those reforms. Social peace and political stability are key for the economic reforms. So sustainable development, by that definition, needs a social and political foundation. And laying that foundation, in other words, of basically what political philosophy would call renegotiating the social contract. In order to overcome political instability, social conflict, and economic stagnation, society needs to renegotiate the social contract. And I would argue that only an inclusive social compromise between the emerging classes that want opportunities and the established classes that fear change can actually provide that stability and social foundation for development.